If you hear the word war, maybe what you imagine is an explosion, invasion, and fierce fighting. But in the history of mankind, the Great War never started with a loud bang. Everything started much calmer. Everything started from trade. And in the 21st century, in the century we live in now, we see that pattern again, with the US-China trade war that continues to heat up. And from that tension, we need to seriously ask, is history ready to repeat itself? And in this video opportunity, we will try to understand it. Why did all the great wars start from the trade war? The Great War did not start with the explosion of weapons or regional conflicts, but history has repeatedly shown that before the sound of the Great War, what was heard first was the sound of tariffs and economic embargoes. From the blockade of Athens over the countries of Megara, which triggered the Peloponnesian War, to the policy of protectionis smootholi, which accelerated the Great Depression and became the pioneer of the Second World War. The economy often became the first field of balancing interests between powers. In the 21st century, the pattern repeats. This time the stage is the trade relationship between the two global powers, America and China. When the world slowly recovered from the 2008 financial crisis wave, many thought that globalization had become a one-way street without turning back. Goods cross the seas in a matter of days. Technology moves faster than any country's regulation, and economic interconnections seem to be uninterrupted. But behind the seemingly harmonious surface, slowly formed a strong reverse flow, a stream that eventually broke through the wall of diplomacy and started a new wave in the form of a trade war. And one of the explosions was the relationship between America and China. To understand the war of tariffs that broke out between America and China, we have to look back a few decades before, when the relationship between the two countries underwent a dramatic transformation. In 1979, when President Jimmy Carter signed the normalization of diplomatic relations with China, the world witnessed the beginning of a new wave in the relationship between the East and the West. At that time, America viewed China as an almost unlimited potential market. And at the same time, China saw America as the key to get out of technological backwardness due to the Cultural Revolution that destroyed its country. The biggest momentum in this economic relationship occurred when in 2001, under the leadership of Jiang Zemin, China was officially accepted as a member of the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Many economists and officials in Washington, as recorded in the official report of Brookings Institution in 2001, were convinced that by opening its economy, China would gradually integrate into a global system that is liberal and based on market law. So after China joined the WTO, trade between America and China grew spectacularly. From only $116 billion in 2000, it jumped to more than $450 billion in less than 2 decades. However, there was something that did not go according to plan. Instead of following the path of democratization led by the West, China actually strengthened the country's capitalist model. They used new economic power to strengthen the influence of the Communist Domestic Party, increase state control over the key industry, and even expand their ambitions abroad through initiatives such as Belt and Road. While American multinational companies enjoyed access to the Chinese market, they also began to complain about damaging practices. Forced transfer of technology, theft of intellectual property rights, lack of transparency and regulation, and dependence of the West on state subsidies. On the other hand, in America itself, the global financial crisis left deep wounds. Many industrial communities in the Midwest and Roosevelt lost their jobs. In addition, cities such as Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh faced economic collapse and mass depopulation. The narrative that globalization only benefits the urban elite and destroys the ordinary working class began to permeate into national politics. The sentiment of protectionism, which previously only echoed on the brink of American politics, is now beginning to rise to the surface of the mainstream. In this context, Donald Trump emerged, a property developer and reality show star, who managed to take advantage of that anger with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Trump not only promised to restore the domestic economy, but explicitly targeted China as the main trading manipulator that must be punished. In various of his campaigns in 2018-2016, Trump swore to impose high tariffs to protect the American industry, especially the automotive and heavy manufacturing industries that have been trampled by cheap imports. After being elected president, Trump did not waste time. In March 2018, in his first period as President of the United States, Trump officially imposed a 25% tariff for beads and 10% for imported aluminum to protect the national security of the United States under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act 1962. It didn't stop there. A few months later, the government used the Section 301 mechanism to investigate unfair trade practices by China, which aimed at imposing additional tariffs on Chinese goods worth $50 billion. The Chinese government responded harshly. They imposed tariffs on various main products from the United States, including wheat, corn, beef, and motor vehicles. These tariffs continued to escalate throughout 2018 and 2019, which caused tensions that not only affected foreign countries, but also disrupted the global supply chain that has been built for decades. According to data from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods rose from only 3.1% in early 2018 to more than 21% at the end of 2019. Meanwhile, China increased their average tariff on American goods from 8% to 20.5% in the same period. This is the largest tariff escalation between the two major powers since the era of the Great Depression in the 1930s. However, what is more dangerous than just trade figures is the psychological and strategic effects of this tariff war. Many multinational companies began to realize that a large dependence on the central Chinese supply chain became a serious risk. As a result, large companies such as Apple, Samsung, and Nike began to move some of their production to other countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, India, and Mexico. A process that, according to the McKinsey Global Institute report, which came out in 2020, mentions the phenomenon as rebalancing of global value chains. This is the process when companies move some of their production activities from one dominant country, such as China, to various other countries in order to reduce geopolitical risks and increase supply chain security. This tariff war also accelerated geopolitical shifts. For Washington, the tariff war is no longer just about fixing trade deficits, but about maintaining strategic domination in the field of future technology, such as artificial intelligence, 5G, and semiconductors. For Beijing, these tariffs are viewed as part of the U.S. strategy to prevent the rise of China, as affirmed by President Xi Jinping at the National Party Congress in 2018. Over the next few years, the two countries did reach what is called the Phase 1 deal in January 2020. In this agreement, China promises to buy additional goods and services from the U.S. worth more than $200 billion in 2 years, while the U.S. cancels some of the small tariffs. However, the implementation of this agreement was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the tension remains high. After Joe Biden won the U.S. election in 2020, many observers expect that the trade policy towards China will change. However, the reality is that most of the Trump-era tariffs are still maintained. Biden even expanded some trade restrictions, especially in the strategic technology sector, such as semiconductor chips. Now, in 2025, Donald Trump will win the presidential election again, and in the initial decrees, Trump affirmed that he will further strengthen the trade policy towards China. The Trump administration has announced a plan for increasing additional tariffs for various sectors, including green technology, electric vehicles, and renewable energy products from China. This pushes widespread speculation that we are witnessing the birth of a new burden in a trade war that could be worse than before. Many economists, such as Nouriel Roubini and Danny Roderick, remind that this tariff war spiral has the potential to accelerate the fragmentation of the global economy into regional trading blocs, similar to what happened in the 1930s. In the long run, this tariff war is not just about who sells more goods, but about who will define the rules of the game for the 21st century economy. History shows that economic fluctuations often become the backbone of political and military tensions. What is now happening between the United States and China is not just a trade war on tariffs and trade regulations, but a war on who will control the future of the world. History has seen it all before. Even before the term trade war became a diplomatic weapon like today, interstate friction through trade has become a weapon that ignites a great war. To understand it, we have to go back to the early 20th century, a time when the world seemed very connected, but was actually plunged into the most brutal war ever experienced by mankind. The early 20th century was a time filled with optimism and confidence that the world was moving towards unlimited progress. Railways crossed the continent, steamboats increased the distance between countries, and the underwater telegraph system made it possible for London and Batavia to speak almost simultaneously. The world, according to economists and sociologists at the time, had become a global market. International trade flourished. Commodities from Asia, Africa, and Latin America flooded European ports, while capital and machinery from Britain, France, and Germany explored the world. John Maynard Keynes, in his book entitled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, recalled the world before the war as a time of global capitalism. Keynes wrote that someone in London could order goods from all over the world, invest their money in Buenos Aires or Batavia, then have breakfast with tea from Cologne, coffee from Brazil, and fruit from South Africa. But history hit them with a bitter reality. In 1914, only in terms of the weak, Europe, and then the world, was plunged into the most brutal war ever known to mankind. And ironically, the economic relationship that was previously considered a guarantee of peace became part of the fuel that exploded the war. However, behind the face of global trade, there was a latent tension between the empires. Trade did not stand alone. It demanded control over resources and distribution channels. And that's where imperialism began to show its teeth. When European countries traded with each other, they actually competed with each other to control the resources of nature and the new market. The British Empire, which at that time controlled a quarter of the world, faced the ambition of the newly rising German Empire. Under Emperor Wilhelm II, Germany chased its departure from Britain and France aggressively. At that time, Germany chased its departure by building a naval fleet, expanding its railway network, and expanding its colonies to Africa. For Germany, trade was not only about goods exports, but also about national prestige and power. Global trade was inseparable from military power. Historian Paul Kennedy, in his book entitled The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, wrote that Germany viewed the control over trade routes and colony areas as a vital element for its economic progress. Ambitious projects such as the development of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway were not only infrastructural projects, but also symbols of resistance to British domination in the Middle East. Britain, France, and Russia also responded by creating an alliance system, mass arms, and an economic bombardment strategy. The global world at the beginning of the 20th century turned out to be non-neutral and peaceful. It was colored by economic tensions, market rivalry, and trade nationalism. Each great power has economic interests all over the world, and when those interests are overshadowed, conflicts cannot be avoided. However, the collapse of the world did not only happen on a geopolitical level. Behind the grip of the global capitalism system, there is a deep rift in the foundation of the world economy itself. Although global trade grew rapidly, inequality and instability still prevailed. The international financial system at that time depended on the gold standard, which created stability in exchange rates, but also restrained the country's response to domestic shocks. Capital and state workers moved across the country's borders, but the political system was not able to manage the social and economic tensions that arose. Giant companies began to emerge and dictate the direction of the national economy. In Germany, reading and chemistry industries such as Krupp and Forbin became the pillars of the country's strength. In Britain and France, large banks such as Rothschild and Paribas controlled the capital across the country. They financed large projects from railways in Egypt to oil fields in Persia, which entangled many others. In the midst of this fragile system, the nationalism of the economy developed rapidly. Big countries began to limit each other's market access, protecting domestic industries and tightening control over the colonies. This tension created an atmosphere of suspicion and permanent competition, which is ready to explode at any time. Tensions between large countries due to the dynamics of the economy took a small spark to ignite a big fire. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, The trigger was not the economy, but the structural causes that made the conflict change into a very global war related to a balanced trade system and economic power. Economic blocs formed before the war, such as Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side, and British, French, and Russian on the other, were not only military alliances, but also a consortium of trade and financial interests. The mobilization of war was done with a capitalistic logic, conflict of supply lines, control over ports and ports, as well as sabotage of the enemy's economy. Britain, which is very dependent on maritime trade, immediately blocked the sea against Germany, preventing the entry of food and medicine. Germany also retaliated with the submarine U-boat that attacked British and American merchant ships. The sea became a battlefield, not only between military armies, but also between global economic logistics. Military strategies that target this global logistics systematically collapse international trade structures that previously supported the world's pre-economy. In 4 years, the global trade system that was proud of at the beginning of this century turned into a death net. Supply lines were destroyed, cities and industries collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, people were hungry, and millions of people died in barren lands that were built to protect the supply lines of coal, wheat, and taxes. And even though the war ended in 1918, the world did not immediately build a peaceful peace. On the contrary, after the voice of the devil subsided, the economic tension and uneasiness left by the war worsened the situation. War winners with their protectionist policies tried to maintain their dominance in the global market. Meanwhile, countries that were defeated were overwhelmed by the burden of war debts and economic sanctions. Large countries that felt disadvantaged by the results of the war, especially Germany, felt the direct impact of the policy of reparation and economic control imposed on them. However, this tension is not only a problem between the winners and the losers. Globally, the world is trying to recover from the damage left by the First World War. However, the international trading system that was so closely connected began to break. New economic blocs began to form, with each country or group of countries trying to protect their economic interests through high tariffs and trade barriers. This tension worsened, creating a deeper economic gap, where one economy no longer functions to strengthen the other economy, but acts as a barrier. Let's go back to 1930, when the United States, which at that time had become the largest economic power in the world, was in the midst of a greater economic disaster than ever imagined. The stock market, which was initially soaring, suddenly collapsed into a collapse that shook the global economy. This was not just a collapse on Wall Street, but a turning point in the history of the world economy that marked the end of a great industrial revolution. The collapse of the stock market speculation at the end of 1929, which culminated in an event known as Black Tuesday, triggered a series of unimaginable destruction. But more importantly, there was a wide impact that immediately followed. Unemployment waves hit every corner of America. Companies rolled up their sleeves. Factories that used to be busy producing consumer goods now stopped operating. Every corner of the country was filled with signs of destruction. Dry markets, bankrupt businesses, and a life that depended on a more fertile hope. In the midst of that economic panic, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. This law raises import tariffs for more than 20,000 types of goods, from agricultural products to manufactured goods. Its purpose is simple: to protect the industry and farmers in the country from foreign competition. But in practice, as was written by economist Douglas Irwin in his book entitled Paddling Protectionism, Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression, this tariff became an international disaster. Because after that tariff was imposed, other countries responded. Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Japan all raised their own tariffs. Global trade volume fell by almost 70% between 1929 and 1933. The world's economic system, which has quickly turned into a trade sabotage field, is not just a decrease in the economy. It is the deterioration of the global system that caused millions of people to lose their jobs, their homes, and their hopes. And in the midst of that chaos, terrible ideologies were born. Fascism in the 1930s was not just an ultra-nationalist ideology. It was a brutal response to the collapse of the liberal economy. In Germany, the Nazi Party rose not only because of anti-Semitic rhetoric or the Aryan supremacy promise, but also because they promised jobs, price stability, and a re-existing industry. Adolf Hitler understood that mass unemployment and the collapse of the global market paved the way for radical ideas. Hitler turned fascism into an alternative to capitalism, which failed, and communism was feared. In his pedagogies, Hitler attacked the Bretton Woods system, which is considered to dictate the world economy, attacking international capitalism and inciting economic autarky. The national atmosphere was free from foreign influence. Under this policy, Germany limited imports, expanded arms production, and directed the economy to support war, as well as Benito Mussolini in Italy, who put the corporate economy as an alternative model to the free market and communism. In Japan, the military took over economic power and forced regional trade blocs, known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, with military power as its market guarantee. Historian Charles Kindleberger, in his book entitled The War and Depression, 1939, noted that the collapse of the world trade system was basically a way for authoritarianism. When countries failed to cooperate in managing the global crisis, economic power moved from the market to the state, from arms trade, from diplomacy to invasion. And when countries could no longer trade, they chose to take over. Invasion became the extension of economic policy, with the military as the main exporter. In a world that is no longer connected by free trade, regional expansion became an alternative to growth. If you can't sell goods abroad because of tariffs and protectionism, then you have to take over the market with force. This is not rhetoric, this is real policy. Nazi Germany began an invasion of Austria and Czechoslovakia to protect the German ethnicity. But the goal of the economy is clear: to control the resources, labor, and industry. Invasion of Poland, Netherlands, and France was not only a military maneuver, but also a breach of industrial infrastructure, agriculture, and logistics. So did Japan, which collapsed in 1931, and then mainland China because they needed natural resources that were not owned in the country: coal, iron ore, and oil. Japan felt economically overwhelmed, especially after the United States and Europe imposed sanctions and embargoes as a reaction to their aggression. When the oil embargo was carried out by the United States in 1941, Japan concluded that if the trade route was closed, then the military route had to be opened. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the direct result of an economy war that was no longer connected. From invasion to invasion, the world was finally plunged into a global war. And that's where the point of no return was seen. That World War II was the point of no return from the failure of the first wave of globalization. The world in the early 20th century once believed that trade would bring peace. But when the system collapsed due to tariffs, depression, and economic nationalism, the world saw the dark side of an unregulated relationship, the birth of fascist power, total war, and genocide. Economist Barry Anker Green, in his book entitled Globalizing Capital, noted that the global financial and trading system at that time was too fragile to face a major crisis. When the crisis came, there were no multinational institutions such as IMF, WTO, or World Bank that could subdue its effects. The world became an arena for powerful countries that competed for profits through domination, not through cooperation. When World War II ended in 1945, more than 70 million lives were lost. Cities were destroyed, industries collapsed, and global trade was almost gone. But from that collapse arose a new determination: to build a global economic system that was no longer at war. The Bretton Woods system, the formation of national unions, and the birth of GATT, which is now WTO, is the direct result of this bloody study. But history does not repeat itself. Yes, it does. And today, when the world again witnesses the rise of tariffs, economic retaliation, sanctions, closed trade blocs, and nationalism again, we are forced to ask, are we taking the same steps towards the same path? Today, tensions between major countries such as America, China, and Russia remind us of the patterns that have existed in history. We can see how these tensions are often related to trade and competition for resources, be it through international trade routes or technology that is developing. Tensions that continue to develop in the relationship between trade between the United States and China, as well as military tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, show that the history of tensions between major countries may be repeated over and over again. These tensions show that although the world has changed a lot since World War II, the basic pattern in the competition between major countries remains relevant. History has taught us that major wars are often started with tensions worsened by economic and trade competition. At the international level, countries are often linked in a complex trade network, where each country depends on another country to meet its economic needs. This dependence often affects how countries interact and negotiate with each other. Countries that have high economic relationships, both in terms of natural resources, manufacturing products, or technology, tend to develop foreign policy that is more careful and strategic. This is because they must ensure that trade relations with other countries remain stable and mutually beneficial. For example, large countries such as the United States and China have a very deep economic dependence. China, as a country with the largest population in the world and a fast-growing economy, are very dependent on the American market to export their goods, especially electronics and manufactured goods. On the other hand, the United States also depends on importing these goods to support its domestic consumption. Therefore, even though there is trade tension between these two countries, their economic dependence creates a form of diplomatic relations that remains maintained. However, this economic dependence is not always harmonious. Countries that feel threatened or dissatisfied with this dependence often look for ways to reduce its tensions. For example, they may change trade alliances, adopt protectionist policies, or even get involved in trade wars to reduce tensions. Therefore, economic dependence can deeply worsen tensions between large countries, especially when one party feels that its dependence is not balanced or loses its national interest. When countries feel that their economic dependence threatens their sovereignty or reduces their freedom in making political decisions, tensions often arise. For example, in the colonial era, colonial countries built very strong economic dependence on their colonies. Colonial countries such as England, France, and the Netherlands exploited natural resources in their colonies. Meanwhile, at the same time, they forced the colonies to buy goods from colonial countries. This economic dependence often creates tensions because colonial countries try to maintain their control over the market and resources. Meanwhile, colonial colonies try to seize economic and political freedom. For example, the tensions between the United Kingdom and the United States in the 18th century are largely related to trade restrictions imposed by the British on their colonial colonies in America. Policies such as tax stamps and the Molasses Act restrictions limit the ability of colonies to trade freely with other countries, creating tensions that eventually arose in the American Revolutionary War in 1775. At this point, the strong economic dependence between the British and the colonies of the American colonies became the trigger of conflicts involving military forces. Economic dependence is not only seen in the context of colonial countries, but also in the relationship between modern countries. Countries that rely on energy imports such as oil and gas are often trapped in trade tensions that can lead to conflict. An example is the dependence of European countries on natural gas from Russia. For years, Russia has used control over energy as a tool to strengthen its political influence on European countries. When tensions escalated, as was the case with the Ukraine crisis in 2014, this dependence became one of the triggers of greater tensions, which eventually affected diplomatic relations and brought large countries to the brink of conflict. In an increasingly global world, trade not only serves as a mechanism to increase economic prosperity, but also becomes a diplomatic tool used by countries to influence the behavior of other countries. Large countries often use trade as a way to expand their influence and dictate the policies of other countries. As an example, the United States has long used economic sanctions and trade tariffs as a tool to achieve its political goals. Economic sanctions imposed on countries such as Iran, North Korea, and Russia aim to change their domestic policy or to punish their international actions, which are considered to be contrary to global interests. Although the purpose of these sanctions is often more to political influence, the reality is that these sanctions are aimed at the dependence of those countries on countries that are stronger in the global trade system. This creates tensions that can develop into larger-scale conflicts if those policies do not bring the desired change. On the contrary, countries that feel threatened by these trade policies will try to form new alliances or find ways to reduce their dependence on major powers. This in turn can trigger political and diplomatic involving more countries. As an example, the trade war between the United States and China is proof of how trade policies can create tensions that affect global diplomacy. Although the two countries depend on each other in various aspects of trade, political differences, and their economic relations will weaken these tensions. However, today, tensions are not only trade and economic policies that are important factors in international tensions, but also competition and technology. And in the current geopolitical context, technology is not only a tool for scientific advancement, but also a weapon that determines economic domination and global influence. Big countries such as America, China, and Russia are involved in an intense struggle to dominate the innovation of technology because they realize that controlling advanced technology can provide countless strategic benefits, both in military, economic, and political matters. Technology has an increasingly important role in determining the status and strength of a country in the global arena. Progress in the field of technology, especially those related to artificial intelligence or AI, quantum computation, and 5G networks provide great potential to strengthen the position of countries in international competition. Countries that dominate this technology will not only have advantages in terms of economic competitiveness, but also in geopolitical influence. By dominating advanced technology, these countries can expand their control over the global market while increasing their military and national security capacity. At the same time, technology also creates new challenges in international diplomacy. Big countries are beginning to realize that modern warfare does not always involve military troops in the battlefield. A more advanced and hidden war takes place in the virtual world, in computing rooms far from the public eye. The influence of technology now covers various dimensions, from the accumulation of intelligent data through digital devices to the ability to manipulate public opinion globally through social media platforms. Therefore, the domination of technology is increasingly determined in international relations. One real example of deep technological competition is between America and China. For the past few decades, these two countries have been involved in competitions to dominate technology, which can provide strategic benefits, both economically and militarily. One aspect that stands out in this competition is the domination of 5G technology, the fifth-generation communication network that is believed to be the foundation of the next industrial revolution. China, with technology giants such as Huawei, has tried to develop and dominate the 5G infrastructure globally. However, the United States, along with its allies in Europe and Asia, have opposed Huawei's expansion in various ways, including sanctions and restrictions on access to advanced technology. This is not just about the economy, but also about geopolitical power. The United States is concerned that China's dominance in 5G technology can give them access to global communication infrastructure, which in turn can be used for spying or control of sensitive data. In this context, we see how technology becomes a weapon in economic and political warfare. Despite the fact that no shots were fired, the impact of this technological competition is very large, changing the relationship between countries and shaping a new geopolitical landscape. Countries that are able to dominate this technology, especially in the field of communication and artificial intelligence, will hold control of the economy and the future of global politics. AI is one of the fields of technology that is increasingly dominating the global competition arena. AI has the potential to change almost every industry sector, ranging from health, education, transportation, to the military. Big countries are competing to be the leaders in the development and implementation of AI technology. AI is not just a tool for economic development, but can also be used as a weapon in modern warfare. For example, AI can be used to develop more advanced defense systems, such as autonomous weapons that can act without human intervention, or to increase the ability to spy and collect intelligence. China, with its long-term vision of becoming a global leader in AI in 2030, has created various policies to support the development of this technology. The Chinese government has invested heavily in AI research and has created an ecosystem that supports the growth of the AI industry in the country. On the other hand, the United States, with giant technology companies such as Google, Microsoft, and IBM, remains the dominant player in the development of this technology. However, the competition between these two countries is getting hotter because the domination of AI has the potential to provide great power in various fields, including the military and the economy. One real example of the sophistication of AI in the military is the development of autonomous weapon systems that can decide for themselves when and where to attack. Major countries, including America and China, have begun to develop this technology, which raises global concerns about the potential risks and consequences of using AI in war. This kind of technology, although still in the development stage, shows how AI can be an important element in technological competition, which is getting sharper among major countries. In addition to competition and the development of physical technology, the Maya world is also becoming an increasingly important battlefield in the context of technological competition. Cybersecurity, which covers everything from defense against digital attacks to data theft and critical infrastructure sabotage, has become an important component of national defense strategies of major countries. Cyber attacks are not only used to damage the country's infrastructure, but also to influence public opinion, disrupt political systems, and manipulate the global market. China and the United States have each been involved in cyber attacks on each other, both on a small and large scale. One of the most famous cyber attacks is a raid on a technology company and a government agency in the United States, which is often suspected to involve major countries with geopolitical agendas. Such attacks are often difficult to prove directly, but the impact on the economy and political stability is very real. As a result, major countries are now more aware that in order to remain leaders in the global world, they must have the capacity to protect themselves from cyber attacks and in turn be able to carry out cyber attacks as part of modern war strategies. This technological competition, although it does not look like a conventional war, has the potential to increase tensions and worsen relations between major countries. Major countries are not only struggling to dominate the latest technology, but also to control the flow of data and information, which is now the most valuable commodity in the digital world. In the next few years, we may see more and more tensions arise because of this competition, which not only involves economic and military power, but also control over information and technological innovation. However, it is important to note that although this competition has the potential to trigger tensions and conflicts, technology also has the ability to be a strong diplomatic tool. International cooperation in the field of technology, especially in the field of regulation and monitoring the development of new technologies, can help prevent larger conflicts. Therefore, the choice between technology as the trigger for conflict or as a bridge of peace is very dependent on how the world handles this competition. And this is where the big question arises again. Looking at the current world situation, from increasing protectionism, tensions in the strategic supply chain, to technological competition and economic sanctions between blocs, we should seriously ask, is the world really learning from history? Or are we repeating the same steps toward the same path? History has given us a pattern that almost always repeats. The economic crisis led to social instability, protectionism broke the work chain between countries. And when unable diplomacy is again bridging interests, power becomes the last negotiating tool. Like what happened in the 1930s, when the Smoot-Hawley tariff and global retaliation accelerated the collapse of international trade, which eventually paved the way for fascism, military expansion, and world war. When trade channels were blocked, military routes were opened. However, today, our world seems more ready, at least in terms of infrastructure. We have the United Nations, WTO, IMF, and a much denser global diplomatic network than in the past. But the question is not just about whether we have the tools, but rather, do we still believe in their use? When countries began to withdraw from international cooperation and the rhetoric of nationalism became stronger, and when technology created a gap in the distinction between countries, as well as mutual understanding, the world was once again in a tense condition that is not unusual in history books. That is why it is important to emphasize, every major war in the modern era, including the First World War, was never started directly with bullets or bombs, but with tariffs, embargoes, and market competition. The trade war is the beginning of a confrontation that is still wrapped up in economic terms. But when economic diplomacy fails and the crisis worsens, conflict can no longer be avoided. Is the world heading for a third world war? The answer is not yes or no, but it depends. It depends on how we are able to defend ourselves, maintain an open dialogue, and understand that in a world that is interconnected, the loss of one country quickly or slowly becomes a burden for everyone. The global tension is not only about who is the strongest, but also about who can learn the most from the past. In a world that depends on each other, cooperation is not an ideal choice, but the only way to survive. And as remembered by history, peace is not a legacy. It is a daily work that must continue to be fought for.